Special Operations Training Detachment, SOT-D West, Burrow Team. Coming at you from NTC, Off the Radar.
This is Off the Radar. I'm Captain Weston Rich, an observer coach trainer for the Green Berets at the National Training Center. This is the third part of our four-part conversation with retired colonels Tom Vogel and Kelly Smith. Last time, we covered mission command and reducing ambiguity at the AOB level. If you missed either part 1 or 2 of this series, please go back and listen to those. You will hear some fantastic insight from those two dedicated members of the regiment. In this episode, you will hear about coaching and mentoring visualization of the battlefield, the use of doctrine for communication and planning to increase understanding, and the role of Army Special Operations Forces in large-scale combat operations. We were talking about kind of centralizing control and authorities and where that risk was. Like, what I'd like to ask now is, how do you coach AOBs on their communication? How do you coach them on forecasting what the mission and what the future of the battle is going to look like, so that they can write that commander's intent and package it up and get that to the downtrace units? What does that look like from your guys' perspective?
The way that I do it is really a couple of elements to it. So the first thing is, again, you have to forecast those requirements far enough in advance that you can put some thought to what you're going to tell them, and coordinate the limited resources that you have. And then really you have to be your own devil's advocate. You have to have some kind of process by which, and it just happened literally a few minutes before I came here, the RTU commander had written a frago and was trying, because of the nature of the comms requirement, he is trying to put a picture into words, which, right, we would say that's 1,000 words. So how do you describe a PLS Hemet, picture of a PLS trailer off of a Hemet to somebody over a 137 message?
Yeah.
And so one practice helps, having the time to put into it by forcing your planning horizon to be far enough out, and by having the discipline to have someone else look at it and be prepared to tell you that it's not good enough, and that that there's error in here, and that you need to make an adjustment perhaps. And it's an iterative improvement over time, I think, that we see over and over again, that as we get better at it over the course of the rotation, then they learn lessons of how to communicate. And that's, I guess, the main way that I do it. The other thing is, I'm constantly challenging them to be more precise. Again, this is squeeze the ambiguity out of things. And even by just going through the process of trying to be precise, I find that you decrease the probability of error in that kind of communication.
Yeah, and I'll take a swing at it as well. So the first start is discussions and planning, right? So it goes back to that old Eisenhower comment or quote, the plan is nothing, but planning is everything. The reason why, part of the benefit of that in terms of conveying commander's intent is that hopefully in planning, before you come definitely to the National Training Center, you have commander to commander discussions, AOB commander to team leader discussions on how you are going to fight the war, how you see the battlefield, where certain key elements take, what general guidance is on certain key elements, such as threshold of violence, such as, are we only going to use division fires, or do you need to protect yourself with anti-armor weapons? Do you need to be able to use anti-armor weapons in the extended, as a direct action option against a target? So those things, I think, have to take place. They should arrive. They don't always arise just as we do the military decision-making process, unless we actually do the war game portion or an abbreviated form of it in which it's a back and forth dialogue. And actually, some of this I learned from Kelly, and I call it the what if game. It's like maybe you don't know the language as a commander, or you're struggling to convey your vision. You can take a certain incident, say it's collateral damage. Say, okay, you see a target in a city. Right now your only option is the MLRS, but you're going to kill 50 people in an orphanage. Okay, do you hit that target? Yes or no? Well, what about in this situation? Yes or no? And and actually we've talked about that back and forth. It's an important dialogue to have, and then from that you can generally figure out your constraints and restraints, and not just be like, hey, operations officer, come up with some constraints, and it lacks flavor when you do that. And then then the great example Kelly uses, and I'm going to violate one of the rules with this and use a word I shouldn't. You might be able to zing it out, but the classic, we're going to go on target and do Green Beret. Okay, what does that actually look like? You tell me in your words, team leader or team sergeant, what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to tell you what I think it looks like.
Yeah.
All right, let's get a common understanding. So, that's one of the key things in communications, planning discussions. I think graphics and general rules in a lost communication environment pays off dividends. So, if you can just say, get used to working phase lines, and something that I've tried to impress on people is you're going to work phase lines. You're going to always be ahead of the brigade. If you kind of knew those two things, even without a message from me, you'd be able to anticipate when you're going to move, where you're going to move, and have some autonomy. If you have your high payoff target list, and you kind of know when it's going to shift from phase to phase, and you kind of know where the brigade is coming, you could at least hear them on the battlefield. You'll know when it's time to move. So I think that could work as well. I'm amazed on a third point how often organizations come here and they have never talked about sending and receiving communications over, by what means. For example, sometimes the first discussion, it seems, of how they'll talk about a PACE plan, but they won't talk about, we're going to follow, say, SAF Sup 7 formats.
Yeah.
The Army actually has a whole manual on reporting, a field manual on reporting, so you can follow certain formats, you can follow the op-word format, but at least to have the discussion of what works in general terms, and oftentimes, since we don't communicate on a day-to-day basis up and down the team room hallway with a radio, you just don't you don't tackle it till you get here. And then I guess we already talked about it.
I want to dogpile on that little communication piece real quick, because the other cultural obstacle we have is, both operationally and in our personal lives, we're used to like instantaneous transmission.
Yeah.
First thought needs to go somewhere, send it, right? There's no obstacle that causes me to pause that. But when we get in this operational environment, we find ourselves, for protection reasons and the technical nature of the communication systems that we're using, that there's probably some pretty prudent rationale behind batching together communications in a format that's prescriptive, that's had planning ahead of the words that are getting sent, all those things that Tom talked about. And I sometimes jokingly, depending on the system that you're using, but you can probably figure out which one is the most guilty. I equate the message center at the AOB will start to look like your teenage kid's Snapchat. I have had this thought that I think needs to be sent to my downtrace element, or the downtrace element has seen something amazing that they want to communicate to their higher headquarters, and seeks immediately a solution to transmit that information bypassing the planning discussion, the devil's advocate, the looking at it with a second set of eyes, the assessment of when is this information actually need to be sent.
Yeah.
And we get this instantaneous ricochet rabbit approach to information management, and it makes it very difficult for people to keep track of what's actually going on, especially when we inevitably and appropriately end up having to use multiple communication systems as we go through. So
that's got to be anything that has a text feature has to be guilty of that.
Right. So that's just training reps that you have to practice that say, hey, yeah, you're right. I know this, and I do want my boss to know it. But understanding the environment and the reporting formats and where we're at in each other's planning cycles, this is when I'm sending it batched with the following.
So that discipline and communication needs to be a two-way street from the down trace unit,
100%.
Whatever that is, ODA, CAT, TPT, up to the command unit, the AOB, in our case, in our scenario. Tom,
I'll just throw in real quick. Something that solves a lot of problems is a pre-9/11, 3-letter, I don't even know what it is, but we called it the QSL. It's like, I received your message, and that was, you just sent QSL this message and you knew it was received. I find 18 echoes that they're no longer familiar with that term. All it says is I received your message, but nor is there a message log. So yes, as things go out on, I won't name the systems, I think just to keep them quiet, but a texting platform is the perfect example.
Well, I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it at the ODA level. Mm-hmm. Hey, I have this thing and I can send a text, whether it's hooked up to a computer or a phone, and I can blast it and then get near immediate responses. And it's like not in a format, so you don't have thought put into it. And then it gets confusion and you have this badminton back and forth, or whatever your sport analogy you want.
At least we know your sport is badminton.
I don't know why I said that. I don't even. But hey, Tom, you reminded me, and I think I've said it on here before. My former battalion commander was Colonel Hardman, who used to just be, or recently the COG at JRTC. He used to tell us as lieutenants all the time, you plan to understand the problem. Your plan's not going to hold up, but you need to frame the problem, and then you can be flexible afterwards, but you got to have a plan. Mm-hmm. Ad-libbed it that, but generally what he was getting after was you got to frame the problem and understand what the problem is. And then on this communication, we kind of hit on the formats and everything. Is there anything you coach with intent for that commander? Like, how much weight is that portion of his message, and then like, is less more, is more more? What do you think on commander's intent?
So I'd prefer, I'd like to see it up front in the message. If guys have trouble getting to anything else, even if they're there's an RT right now who's like, hey, I'm going 5-paragraph order, but maybe don't bury it in paragraph 2, 3A or whatever, just say, sometimes you're just putting it in plain language. Hey guys, I'm proud of you. We're maintaining the pace and tempo that I like. I think in the next 72 hours, we're going to have to relocate some teams. Some of the top decisions on my mind are this and this. Please come back to me if you have some thoughts. I mean, I think that's in plain text. Opening up something that way is worth and disciplined enough to have that, and then say, all right, intel, here's the situation, here's an update on the brigade. And honestly, I think you could omit those because that's going to come in the down rep and be already written for you by taking someone else's work. So anyway, that's a preference I have. There's lots of different ones. Kelly might have a different.
The thing that I always ask when I'm trying to help an AOB commander solve that problem is I say, okay, let's take a walk. And I do it I ask him to think about it in terms of his subordinate units. The staff is usually pretty easy. Even if some of the processes are jumbled, they're co-located, they're working the problem together, they're under the same camo net. The level of shared understanding is usually pretty high. But depending on the how solid the planning was, depending on how long it's been since they've interacted, I will ask the AOB commander in particular, take an honest assessment of how much daylight is there between your thoughts and what you think your ODA commanders or subordinate civil affairs and PSYOPs, again, a lot of times they're co-located. But how much daylight has grown between the two of you and your understanding of the situation. The same thing for the BCT commander and the same thing for the higher commander, whether that's a SOTF or SOGITF or whatever. And once we make that assessment, if we determine honestly that there might be a gap in understanding between me as an AOB commander and one of those other commanders, my number one priority of work is to close that gap. Period.
All right. So I think this kind of ties into that. How do you coach a commander or command team on that visualization piece of when it goes into their understanding of the battlefield, CUOPs, FUOPs, and get into that commander's intent? Like, how are you trying to help them? Our scenario is only so many days long, but like, if you were here for an undetermined amount of time, like, how are you going to navigate this environment so that you can reach the end state that your higher headquarters or that you came up with, and then package that into actionable things for the downtrace units?
Yeah, I might cop out with my answer a little bit by saying it all starts with understanding, right?
Yeah.
But maybe it is the the Colonel Hardman answer of frame the problem, understand the problem. I would just we use the process and the tools of the profession to gain that understanding. And I think if you have a good map and graphics, and together with your staff, you're able to think through some of the top 5 decisions. This is going to frame how you visualize, understand, and then visualize how the battlefield is going to develop. I think looking at where that enemy is, and really that process, the whole your modified combined obstacle overlays, your enemy sit temp, all those things go together to understand what you might want to do, and the rest is it's good dialogues with, hey, what's the brigade or the division commander want? What does my SOTF want? I'll just pause there.
And we're saying the same things, but I'll kind of answer your question with the technique that I use that seems to resonate. And part of it is a little goofy. You're laughing. Do you know where I'm going with this?
No, I'm just like waiting for a question to come back at me.
So completely concur with everything Tom says, right? Like, we have a process that allows us to understand, visualize, describe, and direct the battlefield. And units struggle with it sometimes. Commanders struggle with it. And one of the things that I've found is that absent a cohesive narrative, it's very easy to get in the trap of going through the motions of that process, but never have really grasped the understanding of the problem. And so I challenge commanders to build a narrative, because if you have a narrative, then it allows you to filter what information is relevant or not relevant to that narrative, because we get information overload very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so how do I tell the difference, or how do I help my staff understand the difference between, I've got 3 reports here, they're not all equally relevant to me. But if I don't have a narrative of how I see the fight, then it's impossible nearly for somebody else to tell which one's weighted more. And I use it's kind of a goofy example, right? But if I start telling you a story about a house in the woods and a little girl is approaching the woods and there's an animal in the woods, it's a canine, that's probably enough for you to tell me what the little girl is wearing. Right?
Yeah. Because
we all know that story. So every other piece of it, if I say who lives in the house, we all say grandma. So if we get grandma, we know that goes there, right? Mm-hmm. If I say that the house is made out of sticks and the one next to it is made out of bricks and the one on the other side of it is made out of straw, you say that doesn't fit my story, right?
Yeah.
So, and I just use that as an illustration of the power of a cohesive story, because it gives everyone that understands the story an immediate ability to differentiate between pieces of information. Now that's all kind of goofy and funny. So how does that? How do I get them to do that for the battle that we're in? Well, I find that guys struggle when they're talking about, hey, how would you brief your higher commander? Well, I would spend an hour going over the 5-paragraph op order. How would you brief your subordinate commander? I'd spend 2 hours going through the 5-paragraph op order. That doesn't really give me the cohesive narrative. Well, how about explain it to your wife? Well, you might be talking kind of plain English and it's maybe not precise enough to help you. So what I've found seems to work is, hey, we're right now in the middle of this fight, and your best friend that you went through the Q course with, that he's in another group, and you have a 3-minute phone call with him, and he asks, hey man, what are you guys doing? Like, what's going on over there? And you have 3 minutes to explain to him what's going on. If you can do that, you probably can solve most of your problems in terms of being able to frame the narrative sufficiently to empower your staff, empower shared understanding with your subordinates. And if you can't do that, you probably should take a walk around the camp a little bit, or get some help from somebody to do that. And I found that analogy seems to work, because that counterpart has a sophisticated enough understanding of your kind of operations that you can talk to him in kind of an operational way, but he's disconnected enough from your fight that you kind of have to start with, man, there's a enemy division that's coming through, and the first BTG of it has made contact with the brigade I'm partnered with, and I got my guys XY, boom. And if you can do that, that seems to help them a lot.
There's a lot of references and writings on the elevator pitch, right? Mm-hmm. What would you tell to somebody in an elevator ride? That's all you got to like sell your business that you've been building or whatever. Maybe that's some of it, and that might actually be a good drill for it's something you could reference on the internet that I think falls itself inside what Kelly just described. And I think that's kind of what you're doing. You got a few minutes to describe things, make it stick. I
like it.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna go back to the beginning part of our conversation, talking about your experiences coming up in the Army in the 90s, going from training, for you, Kelly, looking at the Soviet Union or the fall of the Soviet Union, so near peer adversaries in Desert Storm, and then Kosovo was a different animal, but your training and operational experiences through the 90s, 2000s, and the 10s, like competition, conflict, crisis, all that, has warfare changed dramatically in this decade, or are we just doing old things in a different way?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a loaded question. Has warfare changed, right? Like somebody would say that no, since the beginning of time, it's been the same. But I think, right, we're the technology that we have available, the professional level of our formation, is a significant shift in the conditions on the battlefield. But I think the thing that's kind of rung true is that in this type of fight, there's a degree of uncertainty, and leveraging tools that are available to you to work through that uncertainty in order to accomplish your objectives is kind of a timeless principle, right? Mm-hmm. It's just that the nature of the technology is different. Thinking of Desert Storm, I always tell people that Desert Storm was more like being in MASH than it was in being in the GWAD, right? In terms of the magnitude of the technological distinction between those, amazing, right? And so the advent of precision munitions and GPS technology and all that stuff is there, but those are all just the conditions which now overlay probably the timeless point, which is in an ambiguous and uncertain and constantly changing situation. how do you solve problems and try to do the right things.
Yeah, I mean, you could try. It's actually an interesting thing to kind of name and look at all the different Army doctrines that have evolved since we were practicing airland battle doctrine, right? I mean, airland battle doctrine. One of the we love it, right? There's so many great things about it. And is convergence another way of saying synergy? Is there, I guess you could have those questions. I guess I think the problem solving hasn't changed that much. Even, I think the skills and attributes and even the nature, if you think about, the combined training centers, their formats have changed a lot. If you came here during, counterinsurgency and during, in the last 20 years, you went to villages, and it's funny how you even see the remnants out here. There's a road that is like torn to bits. That was a paved asphalt road that runs out into what we call the box out here. It didn't last very long in this desert environment and underneath tank treads, but there was an effort to make it like it was a village. So things have changed, but I think the main takeaway. I'll tell one story, and then I think the main, the one story I have to say is, as I remember as a captain in the career course, and I had finished Special Forces selection. I was waiting to go, and I went to the infantry career course. The rule of thumb was if you were in, you would bypass any towns. There was no work inside the villages. There was no MOUT operations. Battle Drill 7 wasn't enter and clear a room; it was enter and clear a trench. So those things kind of come back, and there still is going to be one of those things that we do a little bit more of. So the emphasis has changed. I think, well. There was another point I wanted to make somewhere in there that'll come back to me.
Yeah.
But I thought it was absurd to think. It's crazy how much time we spent. You're not going to go in the cities. You're going to fight outside of them, and now we know that we will. And just even changing that characteristic, we're probably going to do large scale combat operations in cities as well as in the countryside, and do a wet gap crossing, and but. I think the main thing is looking forward to that next battlefield and try to win the first war. Win the first battle, that is. Yeah. And I think that's what the CTCs are all about, is winning that first battle.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned airland battle doctrine, and then combined arms is another thing that used to be more talked about. Now it's all multi-domain operations.
Right.
Is there a significant difference between any of those? Is it just continue to build on each other, or like what's your take on those?
I don't think it's back to the future per se. Like, hey, this is MDO is. It does not appear to me to be just a rehash of airland battle doctrine. I don't think that's the case. I think that we as a force, those who write doctrine and as we practice it, and I think we've done a reasonable job of not throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there's a lot of good lessons we did learn inside counterinsurgency and in terms of counterterrorism, right? I mean, never before has there been so much interaction between, high-scale intelligence and, some of the new technologies that we have there, even being utilized down to the platoon and company and, levels. There's amazing things that have changed. And I still think, I think, multi-domain operations still has a real taste of, working with diplomats and other agencies as well, because I think that's still going to be a part. Navigating, navigating through political, requirements is still going to be something that we need to do as officers and as units. So let me give it over to Kelly.
Yeah, I guess my take on. I think there is a qualitative difference between combined arms and multi-domain operations, and I think the thing that as we collectively work our way through understanding what is multi-domain operations and how, more specifically, how it applies to Army Special Operations, recognizing that one, it's a condition on the battlefield, right? It's part of the environment, and we're all going to operate on it willingly or unwillingly. But then the question is, at what echelon are you maybe purely defensive and aware in that environment, and what echelon are you offensive and responsible for some effects in that environment? And I think that's a piece that toggles based on the vulnerabilities of the enemy, the priorities of the commanders, and the resources available. So that's I guess my take is we all have to be aware of it. We all need to participate in that environment and account for that in our planning, even if it's at a particular echelon purely defensive in nature. And then as we see opportunities at the right echelon, apply offensive capability in those regards.
Yeah, it almost this is a conversation I'm not ready to go into, so I probably shouldn't broach it. But it goes back to that old, have we gone through an evolution of military affairs or a revolution? And now that we're working with drone swarms and everything else, and it's in the end, I think many technologies have changed since the 1994-ish Airland Battle Doctrine. I think the changes, and although they collectively, I think our new doctrine is actually revolutionary, probably compared to the problems we were solving with Airland Battle Doctrine. We were trying to just get the Air Force and the the Navy and the ground forces to come together and provide mutual support to them. Now that's not even a question anymore. It's legally not a question. It's the way we work and interact is not really a question. So maybe that's some of the changes that, now it's Now how do we look at these other domains, space, cyber? Yeah. How do we look at those? How do we enter that into the fold? Is I think our new question.
Yeah. So probably as a joint force, we gained a lot of experience through the global war on terror, doing that joint integration when it comes to at least U.S. forces and our close partners and allies. But some of that was probably codified into actual, not only doctrine, but in the U.S. government, like Title 10, hey, you are going to work together, that in years past was not the case. And then experientially, leaders have that, although unfortunately, probably a lot of those leaders are, like you gentlemen, have hit your time and you've retired. But now you're giving back to the force, so you're passing on that experience and knowledge.
Yeah, and I think you're making me think of something, which is not what you asked about, but I used to kind of think through, how well have we trained our adversaries over, our coin and GWAT and everything else in our 20 years at war. You could say, yeah, we trained them pretty well, but there's no substitute for, I think, what the experience our military has gone through in terms of growth. I think it's a fallacy to think our adversaries can just look at us and be like, okay, we understand precision fires now, or we're not going to employ them, or, we have an experience that we have gone through, I think, that cannot be replicated. And I also, I don't think there's any other nation on the world we're the pacing item for ourselves. We have to beat ourselves to be better every time. I think that's what we do here at the CTCs. And I don't think anybody else anywhere in the world is doing the kind of serious training that we're doing, so, and I just mentioned that maybe that's a little bit off of what the subject that you were talking about, but the so what is can you just all of a sudden you can definitely go from you don't need a landline to then go 5G as we did in Afghanistan, but it's really hard to do 5G and understand and have all those things. That's an analogy. It's really hard to just we're just going to be like the Americans. We've done a lot. There's been a lot of doctrinal growth. But the experience is still there inside the formation.
So we were talking about multi-domain operations. How do you coach and mentor AOB staff and AOB command teams on their role as RSOF in multi-domain operations, in large-scale combat operations?
Well, the first step of that goes back to an earlier part of the discussion we had about doing the right things. And part of doing the right things is what have you been told to do by your higher headquarters. And so the assessment or the analysis, the confirmation that the certainty of shared understanding with your higher commander to say, what is it that you're asking me to do? And then, do I have the capacity to do that? Do I need additional resources? And just walk through the problem. And then going back to very early in the conversation, you may be having this discussion about something you know very little. And so do you approach with the humility and the curiosity to educate yourself and have a dialogue to go into a planning discussion so that you can develop an understanding of what's in the art of the possible. And so I really don't see that as wildly different than anything else, because and again, we're not in a bottom-up driven environment in LISCO. So other than looking for opportunities in the domains, which I think is a perfectly reasonable requirement to put on an AOB level headquarters. But I think the start point for that is what are you being asked of from your higher headquarters? What are you being directed to do from your higher headquarters? Because they have prescribed that because they think it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Tom?
Yeah, you definitely can't go wrong by kind of looking who's in your chain of command and reading up the Army pay chart and doing what that person says, right? And there's a lot of expressions from that, but that definitely are coming out of the regiment. So one thing we definitely start with is being attuned to what the regiment is saying. So it starts with that. So I would say, just as a bona fides of we're as coaches, we're not trying to tell you what we did or learned 10 years ago, although that's part of it. It does start with which way is the regiment going now, and that's expressed to us definitely by the Special Operations Training Detachment that's both here at Fort Irwin and at Fort Johnston. With that, but to maybe get more to something we talked about earlier, something of an elevator pitch, something of in a short sentence, what are we? I think Army Special Operations Forces are warriors who are masters of irregular partnered operations. And there's three parts to that. So if I were to break that down, what is RSOF and LISCO? Mm-hmm. We remain warriors who are masters in irregular partnered operations. So what does the warrior part look like? Well, okay, it's large scale combat operations. Where do the warriors? Where do we work? And we kind of talked about it. It's no longer necessarily your pistol and your rifle; those are important. But it is the anti-armor weapon systems. It is using fires. It is communicating with and protecting yourself with you're communicating with still under low probability of intercept, low probability of detection. So those are the new attributes I think for that are required of a warrior in large scale combat operations. And I would add to that too. Direction from the force is to develop the special operations, cyber and space triad. So we want to learn about that too. And how do you learn about that? Well, incrementally, I think. Do you need to know everything about cyber or about space? No, but I use the term a MacGuffin device. Sometimes you just need to have the device, and know like, if I put this somewhere, it's going to do some type of cyber effect. And I think over time, we'll grow in that learning. So warrior, right? The partnered piece is, you still have to have at the center of what you do, I think, working with partners. And that generally tends to be some type of special purpose force, which, by the way, the United States military and RSOF has developed for 40, 50 years in some countries. It's been an ongoing work. And I think we've done substantive and foundational work inside that. So continue to do that. Continue to work through partners. Maybe look for other ones. And work at their capability too. It's still going to be them that give you access into the deep and the extended deep, and make you survivable. So and that gets us into the irregular warfare part. What's special about what we do? That means that we're not a replacement for the RISTA battalion, RISTA squadron. We're not a replacement. We're not replacing brigade screening or guard forces. What we're doing is getting into extended deep. We're able to do that because we're able to work with populations. We're able to hide ourselves. We're able to go perhaps extended times if necessary without communications with higher and still accomplish a commander's intent. So I think that those are some characterizations that I would break down. The warrior piece, what does it look like? What does a regular warfare look like for us? And then also, that central piece of partnered operations. And I'd say by now, every unit in the U.S. military does partnered operations in some way, right? There's sometimes there certainly are armor units that work with other armor units. We see it throughout. The Army does that, but I think to do so at the level that we do it, I think we're still the world's premier force for partnered operations as well.
Absolutely. I hope you enjoyed this episode and take away a nugget about one of the topics that we covered, such as forecasting operations, visualization of the battlefield, or developing commander's intent. Next time, we will touch on battlefield geometry of Army Special Operation Forces in large-scale combat operations. Thank you for listening to Off the Radar, where RSOF prepares for conflict. Like, subscribe, and share on your listening platform.
Actions will determine the outcome.